In part 1 of this deep dive into Aaron Rodgers' career, we explored the timeline of events in his career thus far. In today's episode, I'm examining the claim that the Packers have failed to give Rodgers top-tier weapons throughout the years, making the multiple playoff disappointments the organization's fault, not his. To set some ground rules, Rodgers did not become the full starter until 2008, so anyone on the team from 05 to 07, but not 08, will be excluded from this list as he didn't really get a chance to throw to them. Starting in 2008, he had two wideouts that would end their career in the Packers Hall of Fame. The leading receiver on the team was 25-year-old Greg Jennings. Jennings was in his third year in the NFL in 08. He finished the year with 1,292 yards and 9 touchdowns. Across from him was an older, yet just as talented wideout named Donald Driver. Driver, who was 33, finished the year with 1,012 yards and 5 touchdowns. His top tight end was Donald Lee, a solid but not spectacular player. He also had small contributions from young receivers Jordy Nelson and James Jones, but we'll touch on them more later on. He also had a back that carried the ball for 1,203 yards and 4 touchdowns on the season in Ryan Brandt. Now, some would say that receiver stats look good only because Rodgers is so talented, but consider this. Donald Driver was drafted in 1999. For much of his prime, he played with Favre, not Rodgers. He was a 1,000-yard receiver 5 times before 2008, including 3 seasons with 1,200 yards. He also finished his career with 10,137 yards in total. That's best for 51st all-time, just behind Andre Rison and Lance Allworth, a Hall of Famer. You could argue that Driver was already on the downswing of his career by the time Rodgers took the reins. So let's take a closer look at his counterpart, Greg Jennings. Drafted in 2006, he was already making an impact on the field with Favre at his quarterback. In 2007, Jennings finished just short of 1,000 yards, but grabbed 12 touchdowns the same year. While Jennings never had a 1,000-yard season after Rodgers, he did still put up some pretty solid numbers. In 2013, he had 804 yards along with 4 touchdowns. In 2014, he had 742 yards and 6 touchdowns. Those numbers might not sound too impressive, but they were good enough to lead both of those teams. And seeing as his quarterbacks were Christian Ponder and Teddy Bridgewater, I would say he did the best he could under those situations. His career total of 8,291 yards puts him 98th all-time, just ahead of the likes of Golden Tate and Amari Cooper. Moving on to 2009, the team again had 2 1,000-yard receivers in Driver and Jennings. However, this year they had more of a tight end presence. 22-year-old Jermichael Finley finished the year with 676 yards along with 5 touchdowns. They also once again had a back go for over 1,000 yards. I mentioned James Jones earlier in this video. Jones is the type of receiver to get overlooked and forgotten by time. But in reality, he was a very solid wide receiver 3 in almost any offense. Throughout his 9 years in the NFL, he averaged 691 yards a season. His 2 best seasons came in 2012 and 2013. In 2012, he led the NFL in receiving touchdowns with 14. The following year, he racked up 817 yards. In 2014, he left Green Bay to Oakland, where he had 666 yards and 6 touchdowns in 1 year before returning to Green Bay the following season. 2015, which would be his last season, he had 890 yards and 8 touchdowns. The year with the Raiders, for the record, he was second on the team in receiving yards, and his quarterbacks were a rookie Derek Carr and future XFL quarterback Matt McGloin. 2010 was the team's magnum opus, the Super Bowl run. In that season, Jennings led the team with 1,265 yards and 12 touchdowns. James Jones and Donald Driver both had solid seasons. However, this year was the rise of the other wideout I mentioned earlier, Jordy Nelson. Nelson had 582 yards in 2010, good enough for 3rd on the team. The next year, however, he would explode on the scene.
They fake the handoff. Rodgers, time over the middle. Jordy Nelson. Jordy Nelson inside the 20. Touchdown, Green Bay. Spread him out again. Rodgers has time, slings it to Nelson. Touchdown, Green Bay. Rodgers, Jordy Nelson. Touchdown, Green Bay.
You get one-on-one on the outside against William Gay, and you see the hand check right there.
Blitz coming off off the edge. Packers pick it up. There's Nelson. First down. Inside the 20. Gets a block. Polamalu knocks him out of bounds.
Boy, that's gutsy there. Full house, and there goes Jordy Nelson. Nelson will score. No flags are down. Count it.
He would catch over 1,000 yards in 4 of the next 5 seasons. Likely the only thing that stopped him in 2012 was a hamstring injury that held him out of 4 games in total and caused him to sit 2 extra games almost entirely. All 4 of those seasons, he had well over 1,000 yards. 2011, he finished with 1,265. 2013, he had 1,314, while 2014 was his personal best with 1,519 yards. He also led the league in touchdowns in 2016. And, much like James Jones, Nelson would end up going to Oakland towards the end of his career. That season, he had 739 yards, best among wideouts on the team. Ultimately, he would retire with 8,587 yards, putting him just over Hall of Famer Paul Warfield on the all-time receiving list. 2011 featured more or less the same cast from 2010, but starting in 2012, a new name would emerge in the offense. Randall Cobb would lead the team with 954 yards in 2012. By 2014, he had his first 1,000-yard campaign. As time marched on, he developed a strong friendship with Rodgers, to the point that Aaron openly fought for Cobb to reunite in Green Bay in 2021 after spending 2 years away. 2013 was a down year for the club. Aaron only played 9 games. However, Jordy Nelson still had well over 1,000 yards, while James Jones posted his personal best receiving numbers. The third receiver that year was a new name, that being Jarrett Boykin, who finished with 681 yards by year's end. The season also marked the first time since their Super Bowl that they had a 1,000-yard back, as the team had drafted Eddie Lacy. Most people forget, but when Lacy entered the league, he was actually pretty good. He had 2 1,000-yard seasons in his first 2 years, and was on track for 3 before getting sidelined by an injury that he never recovered from. 2014, the team had 2 receivers that would go well over 1,000 yards. Nelson had 1,515, and Cobb had 1,287. Lacy again had 1,000 yards on the ground, but none of that was more important than a new, young, 22-year-old who joined the team. His name? Davante Adams.
Touchdown, Davante Adams. His first NFL.
Adams would go on to be arguably the best weapon Rodgers ever had. He dominated games in a way that others on this list never quite did. Adams, by the way, only had 3 years over 1,000 yards with Rodgers. He came close in 2019, but missed 4 games due to injury. And unlike some other names on this list, you cannot make the case that Rodgers made Adams. Because in 2022, Adams decided to leave Green Bay and headed to Las Vegas, where he reconnected with his college quarterback, Derek Carr. Despite the Raiders' struggles to find the win column, Adams did all he could, racking up 1,516 receiving yards and a league-leading 14 touchdowns. While I have touched most of Aaron's biggest targets so far, I have a few honorable mentions. He had the 2010s All-Star Jimmy Graham at tight end for a few seasons, as well as wideouts Allen Lazard and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who just won the Super Bowl in Kansas City. He also has had consistently solid backs. Even to this day, the Packers enjoy the likes of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. Now, some would look at this list and say, while there is some talent here, there isn't any exceptional names outside of potentially Davante Adams. To that I say, let's look at some other quarterbacks that are considered top tier in NFL history. Dan Marino, who most claim is a top 10 all-time quarterback, arguably only had 2 great weapons on his teams, that being Mark Clayton and Mark Duper. Tom Brady won the Super Bowl in 2003, throwing to the likes of Deion Branch, David Givens, and an old Troy Brown. Hey, you might be saying, Deion Branch was a good player. And he was. But he wasn't an all-star. He ended his career with 6,644 yards, well under Greg Jennings and Jordy Nelson's numbers. I would also personally argue that a truly great quarterback helps receivers make that next step. Matthew Stafford helped Cooper Kupp improve from an albeit solid NFL receiver to one that is second all-time in yards in a single season. Who's number 1 on that list for the record? Only Kelvin Johnson, who also had Stafford as a quarterback. So in my humble opinion, the Packers have put plenty of weapons around Aaron. Is it the most a quarterback has ever had? No, but it should have been enough to lead to more success than they had. He consistently had 1,000-yard receivers and runners on his team. Quarterbacks like Stafford and Marino would have loved to have more 1,000-yard backs than they had in their careers. And if you argue their defense has been lacking, I would point to 2021. Now, I'm not saying that they've always had a top-tier D. However, in the divisional round game versus the 49ers in 2021, the Niners only managed to score 13 points the whole game on that Packers defense. Rodgers, however, was only able to manage 10 points.